Good evening. Good evening and welcome very, very much to this segment of Conversations, where I'm pleased to welcome to the program Mr. Hedrick Smith. I shouldn't think Mr. Smith would need any introduction at all to the viewers of Conversations, but I would like to mention that Mr. Smith, of course, who has written for a long time for the New York Times, written seminally on the Soviet Union and so forth, and has a relatively new book out called The Power Game, which I'd like to show right out here at the outset, how Washington works. And without further ado, Hedrick, or Rick Smith, if I may, welcome to Conversations.
Harold, thank you. It's real nice to be with you.
We want to talk a great deal about the book and also about the public television series that's following upon the book. It's an interesting title, The Power Game. In many aspects, the power relationships within Washington and so forth does resemble a game in many ways.
Well, you can look at it. I didn't mean it as a put-down. You can look at it as so much adult foolishness, you know, very much like a child's game. But I really meant something more than that. I think it's a serious game. I think the consequences are important to all of us, whether war or peace or taxes or Social Security, what have you. What I was trying to suggest with the game idea was that there are patterns to it, rituals. There are smart moves to make. The clever politician understands, the clever leader understands what the moves are, what the customs are, what the rituals are. Jimmy Carter, for example, was a very popular man out in the primaries in 1976 when he ran. He was a very bright man. He went to the Naval Academy, studied as an engineer, very ambitious, very idealistic. He wanted to tackle all kinds of problems, nuclear energy, the tax system, energy generally, and so forth. But Jimmy Carter didn't understand the power game.
It did seem that way.
He didn't. And it's a tragedy. One of the reasons he didn't do well in Washington was he ran as an outsider. He stayed an outsider. His staff didn't mix with the people up on Capitol Hill. Tip O'Neill, who was Speaker of the House, fellow Democrat, said Jimmy Carter, one of the brightest men I ever knew, but he didn't understand the politicking with other members of the Democratic Party. His chief of staff, Hamilton Jordan, saw Tip O'Neill so infrequently that Tip O'Neill called him Hannibal Jerkin. There's that kind of standoffishness, being aloof. Another thing is, like many people in public life, he promised the public a lot. Made a lot of campaign promises, had an ambitious agenda. But a sprawling agenda is not good for a new president. You come in, you've got 100 days, you've got 3 or 4 months to really make a mark on the presidency, set the tone. You need to do 1 or 2 or 3 things. Reagan did that in 1981.
He certainly did. He did.
So that's what I mean by a game. I mean, it's like knowing how to play football. It's like knowing how to play chess or
I think you said Go. The game of Go is a very interesting game for bureaucratic.
Or water polo or basketball. There are smart ways to play the game. And I'm trying to get at much more than that. When I talk about the coalition game and the agenda game, these are the things that make the presidency work.
Absolutely,
So this is intended to be light and humorous, but it's also intended to be serious and thoughtful about American government.
And indeed it is. And it's important that a president and the administration coming in and others that are trying to operate in terms of the public service and so forth understand the rules of the game so they can most effectively operate. And that's one of the most important criteria for being able to do a good job in those positions.
And they're also...
Apart from the vision of ideology and ideas and that sort of thing, right?
Substance matters. But there's also the up and down. A lot of people in Washington are concerned who's up, who's down, what's in, what's out, techniques. And also, I mean, you start looking at the lobbying game. American politics has changed enormously.
That's what I wanted to ask you.
Power exploded. There was a power earthquake in our system, and most people didn't notice it. Back in the mid-'70s, early '70s, 1974, what happened was Congress rose up against the White House.
In the aftermath of Watergate?
In the aftermath of, first of all, the Vietnam War. Watergate. Congress came to feel they didn't trust the executive branch. You couldn't get a straight story on the war, on the budget, on the economy, and so forth. So Congress took a certain amount of power back. Then what happened was, within Congress, there was an upheaval. Had a lot of junior members come in, particularly in the class of '74, on the heels of Watergate, and they took power away from the old committee chairmen, the Southern Barons, the Wilbur Mills, the Dick Russells, the people like that. They lost power in 1975. The junior members threw out 3 old committee chairmen in the House, and the power game opened up. Everybody started running in different directions. Television affected that. They began to appeal directly to the voters. So what happened was that power sprawled, lobbying changed, the image game, television came along. Our political system became much, much harder to run. And these are kind of things we need to kind of take a look at when you're in the tail end of election or the start of a new term. How's the new president going to do? What kind of Congress is there going to be? If they don't know how to play the game, they don't understand it, it's not going to work.
Absolute primer for people who would think of public service, your book, I might say. And so when I wonder through time, if you have any large organization, corporate organization, military organization, have different ground rules in terms of the way they work. They tend to be more hierarchical, authoritarian perhaps.
Absolutely.
And many people who've been in, it's a corporate responsibility, CEO or something, or in a high military ranking or other organization, might have a little bit difficult time understanding the way Washington and the power relationships among the people in Washington works when they come into that, don't you think?
I think that's right. Probably the only people who might have a sense of it, if they're real good political operators, are people who come out of the academic world. My understanding is that a faculty on a college is just about as crazy and unpredictable and hard to manage as Congress.
I was going to say, bureaucracies in general, or bureaucracies of large organizations, have a certain dynamic to them.
But bureaucracy is different from Congress.
Yeah, all right.
In Congress, nobody's the boss. The Speaker cannot give orders to the lowest ranking Republican in the House. Barney Frank, a congressman from Massachusetts, said to me, he said, being in Congress is more like being in high school than any place I've ever been since. The same kinds of things that get you popularity and influence, and being a good student, working hard, but being friendly, being likable, having those traits. You have the power of persuasion.
Yeah.
That's what works.
Yeah.
And I've talked to businessmen. Mike Blumenthal, now the chairman of the board at Unisys. It was before
Commerce.
No, he was Secretary of the Treasury.
Oh, that's right. Of course,
of course. From industry.
That's right. Yeah.
It drove him crazy. George Shultz, when he first came, from business and even from the academic world, couldn't get used to the structure. Don Regan had a terrible time when he came from Wall Street down to Washington. Because power spread, you got to touch a lot of bases. You can't give orders.
Yeah.
It's not like the military. But what's interesting is the military is similar to business.
Interesting. Yeah.
Hierarchical.
Right.
But if you look at the way the Pentagon plays its games, there's a lot of turf stuff. The Army has its turf. The Navy has its turf. Air Force has its turf. They carve up the budget the same way the old cartels used to carve up the market. They don't interfere too much with each other. There's supposed to be a lot of military rivalry, service rivalry. There's an awful lot of collusion to make sure the Army gets its share, the Navy gets its share. They don't mess around too much with each other. All the games are enormously different and enormously fascinating.
I wonder if we get a longer historical perspective. We do want to talk about that 1974 sea change and so forth, and also television, obviously, we want to talk about. But a longer perspective on the political process in the United States. Has it been changing rapidly through time? If we look 1 century, 2 centuries sweep through time, have the rules and the ways in which our public policy and our public trust is being enacted and so forth, has it changed through time significantly from the birth of the Republic?
It has changed through time. One of the striking things about the American Constitution, by the way, I'm doing this television series.
Absolutely, we want to talk about that.
I interviewed George Will at one point. He said, if I had any piece of advice to Americans, it would be, if you want to understand your government, don't read the Constitution. Read the Washington Telephone Book, particularly the section that begins National Association of. What's that mean? It means enormous list of lobbies, running through Washington. So that certainly is one tremendous change. As a matter of fact, just since 1974, the numbers of since 1961, the numbers of lobbyists went from about 365 to about 21,000 today, registered lobbyists. The number of Washington lawyers in 1974 was 21,000. Today, nearly 50,000. The numbers of people working for trade associations, 75, 80,000. It goes on and on. There were probably a couple of dozen reporters at most in the White House, in the Oval Office with Harry Truman when he told them about the atomic bomb. Today, you got 1,800 reporters accredited to the White House, 10,000 journalists working in Washington. I mean, it's just been an explosion.
That's been an experience, in the modern experience, more or less, in terms of the what's been going on. In a longer term sweep, the government, the federal government, and the operation of the federal government within an interdependent system and so forth has become increasingly more relevant to the operation of our society, to the general citizenry, than it has been historically.
No question.
And for this reason, Washington becomes ever more a center of real power.
The reason for all those lobbyists is that power is emanating from Washington. The government is in more of our lives, in more areas, regulating the environment, the workplace, deciding who's going to get the right to show television, films or movies, that kind of stuff, show movies. Big battle, Hollywood or the television networks, who gets the residual right to movies? How do they settle it? Not in the marketplace, not at Wall Street. They go to Washington. I mean, one thing after another. But there's another enormous change. Political parties, never mentioned in the Constitution, very unpopular with the Founding Fathers when they wrote the Constitution. Madison, Washington, Jefferson, all had terrible things to say about political parties. But as soon as the Constitution was passed, ratified, and they got into government, they began to form political parties. And what is striking is that for the first 150, 160 years of our republic, we had basically one-party government most of the time. That means the same party controlled the White House, the House, and the Senate, 3/4 of the time. It gave a certain cohesion to government, even with the checks and balances. In the last 35 years, 2/3 of the time, one party controlled the White House, usually the Republicans, and the other party controlled either part or all of Congress. It has made for stalemate after stalemate after stalemate. I mean, think of the last 4 years. Ronald Reagan won one of the largest landslides of any modern president. 59% of the vote, all but one state and the District of Columbia. He took all the electoral votes. In 192 congressional districts, people voted for Ronald Reagan for president and picked Democrats for the House of Representatives.
They're splitting their ticket. They're not voting the straight party line like they did.
No, that is a big thing, big change from the 19th century, even a big change from the early 20th century. And what does that mean?
What does it
For the last 4 years, it's meant deadlock over the aid to the Contras, deadlock over defense spending, deadlock over Social Security, deadlock over tax increases, deadlock over how to deal with the Russians most of the time, deadlock over SDI. I mean, when people put in the two opposite parties and give them a power base in the government, you not only have checks and balances, you've got deadlocked government. You've got stalemate.
Well, it was meant to be a checks and balance and so forth in terms of that. I wonder, what does it say about the country when the Democrats have a virtual lock on the Congress or in the House of Representatives, seemingly. Senate seems to go back and forth and so forth, and the executive increasingly is Republican. I wonder what that says about the mind of the general voters and the general citizenry toward their government, that such as it seems to be emerging.
Well, some pollsters think, and they find a little bit of evidence, that people are doing that on purpose, particularly in 1984, that a certain portion of the people say, I'll pox on both their houses. Don't trust the Republicans, don't trust the Democrats, I'll put them both in power and they won't get anywhere. But not most people. I think it doesn't say so much about public attitudes as it says about something about our system. You mentioned the lock. The real lock is on the House of Representatives.
Democrat.
If it's not Democrat, it is incumbency, and the incumbents are Democrats. The enormous advantage in the American political system today in the House of Representatives goes to the incumbents. They have staff, they have travel allowances, they have the mail frank, they have visibility, they have video satellite feeds, and the whole technology.
A good parking spot.
The parking spot doesn't keep them in power. They got that. You're absolutely right. But they have all these advantages, and on top of that, political money from political action committees flows to the incumbents 6 times as much money as it does to the challengers.
So incumbency is ever more powerful as a deciding factor.
Last time around, 97.7% of the incumbents in the House of Representatives who sought re-election got re-elected. It's been way over 90% for the last 15 elections in the House. Senate fluctuates more. You can have a famous name, you can have a lot of money in the family, you can have been a governor, you can have gotten notoriety before you ran from the Senate. But in the House, politics is very, very local, and the incumbency is very powerful. We don't have a fair election system. There are only about 30 or 40 districts in the country where there's even much contest. Both parties know it.
Could you see major changes in the way we do about selecting our public officials and so forth at the national level?
Not unless
that would make it more fair?
Not unless there's a scandal. Not unless there's a scandal. It's going to take, I mean, political action committees are pouring enormous amounts of money into the campaigns. And they aren't doing it, as Bob Dole says, because they like the color of their hair. And sometimes they put money into a campaign after the campaign's over. You know, that's one of the latest things that happens in the American system. What happens is the candidates have debts. When they're done with the campaign, they go around to these political action committees, and they get paid off. Great thing for a political action committee.
After you're in.
After you're in, they know who they want favor with. So that's what's going on. I think that if eventually the public gets the impression that essentially votes are being bought, either openly or virtually. They're being bought, and I've talked to some people in here, and they talk about how that works. If the public gets outraged about that, then I think the system of financing campaigns may change, and that could change the way. It could
some public system of financing, or
well,
would that be
some kind of, maybe a subsidy of television time. Television time is what candidates want.
That really is of the essence. I mean, that really is important. That's one of the other factors that's come in that the political parties, many people have said, have been replaced in a certain sense in terms of the importance of television and the media in general. The press and the media, and particularly the electronic media, has become a fact of life in terms of influencing thought and consciousness and the political process itself in the modern experience, hasn't it?
In the old days, if you were running for office in Chicago or New Orleans or Boston or San Francisco or Memphis, Tennessee, you made your way through the party.
That's right.
As they say, as Tip O'Neill says, you worked your way up through the chairs. You ran for local assembly or for city council, and you finally made it to the state legislature, and you did pretty well. Then you finally got to run for Congress. So you had a debt to the party. The party organization helped you. And when you got to Congress and the party leaders came around and they said to you, hey, the party position is this, we want you to support the president, or we want you to oppose the president, depending upon which party you're in. You're kind of stuck with the party. Nowadays what happens? Somebody decides they want to run for Congress, they can form an organization, they can raise some money, they can buy television time, they run independent of the party. And when they get to Congress, the party leaders come around and say, hey, well, this is a party position, we'd like you to vote for us. I say, well, let me think about it. I'm not so sure I want to do that. That doesn't suit me or it doesn't suit my district. They're very independent. It's had an enormous impact on the way government operates. Parties are cohesive forces. Parties got a bad name with the voters. People say, I like to vote for the candidate, I don't like to vote for the party. But what happens is you got a system of government where the power just doesn't pull together.
Yeah, and this electronic media particularly, the television particularly, has had an incredible effect in terms of educating and even now with Brian Lamb and C-SPAN, bringing the Congress and the government right into the homes through cable and so forth. These things, these media effects, really do have a profound effect in terms of the way power is garnered and exercised in our society increasingly. Electronic media, don't you think?
I do.
Yeah.
And people like Lamb and C-SPAN, when they're holding the camera up to politicians when they're actually doing their work, is one thing. But what's really going on, and the stories I got in here, are how they arrange the video satellite feeds. The president gives the candidates and the people in office marketing themselves the same way you market a bar of soap. The president makes a State of the Union address. You know what's going on afterwards? I watched it happen many times. You sit there, you hear the president, the reporters are all up in the gallery, the Supreme Court's down there, the cabinet's down there, the foreign diplomatic corps is there, the president makes a speech in the well of the House, and the crowd disperses afterwards, and you can see the president drive down his motorcade and so forth. You go down to the basement of the House, you know what's going on? In one room, like H-132 in the House side, you got about 40 or 50 Democrats, and on the other side you got a whole bunch of Republicans, and there's a camera sitting there just as there is in this room here, and there's a mark on the floor, and there's a young lady standing there holding a microphone, and each congressman comes up, and they do an assembly line, 45 seconds to a minute. They stand there and say, the president tonight was right, if they're Republicans, to say this, and I'm really for the president. And the Democrats get up there and say, the president really wasn't right, we need to do something about trade or jobs or whatever. And that goes out instantly on a satellite video feed. They package that. It goes out on a satellite video feed, and if you're in Colorado or if you're in Hartford, Connecticut, or you're in Miami, Florida, whatever, it comes on, and the local station takes that right off the video feed and saying, here's our own congressman, and here's his reaction to the thing. They're out there. They do it with radio spots. They do it with video spots. They set up television stuff, and most of this stuff is subsidized by the taxpayer, and taxpayers don't.
That's interesting, isn't it? And so that's really an exercise of government in a very real sense. And how that is done, is it well understood? Is it well regulated? Are there changes? Are there alternative ways in which information, electronic information, might be able to be got to the citizenry than it has? Again, in keeping with trying to have a more just system or a more well-balanced or appropriate system in terms of informing the citizenry? Or what do you think?
No, certainly press conferences, certainly town meetings are important where people go home and they're responsive to the voters. But what you're getting here is packaging. This is exactly the same way, as I say, you sell soap. There's no monitoring of this. Each party knows the other party's doing it, and very rarely do the television stations say, hey, this is an electronic press release, not gotten by our reporters, but prepared. I mean, normally speaking, when the press interacts with a politician, you ask questions, tough ones, here and there. Why do you say that, Senator? Give us an explanation. What's the background on that? And then you put together a story which kind of gives the pros and cons. Well, this is all designed to give whatever spin the politician wants.
A media advisor, electronic media advisor, is somebody who, like Mr. Reagan was an actor, he has a good sense of directorship and these kind of things and taking directions, and that a media director is somebody who can effectively have the candidate or the political person and so forth be able to use effectively the media. Is it a very important plus in terms of exercise of power now?
In this book, The Power Game, I sit down and tell you how the best minds and talents in the Reagan administration literally scripted the Reagan presidency.
Right.
He didn't invent it. They didn't invent
Yeah,
it.
right.
Teddy Roosevelt took reporters with him to San Juan Hill to create a legend. You know, Franklin Roosevelt had his radio chats. Jack Kennedy was famous for sparring with the press at press conferences. Jimmy Carter wore his sweaters and walked down Pennsylvania. Lots of people have been worried about imagery.
But Mr. Reagan was a master.
Well, not only was he a master, not only was
people
he a master,
around him,
but the people around him were advertising people, PR people, marketing people, and literally events were planned in order to have an impact. Let me give you an example. Reagan's first meeting with Gorbachev, right? 1985, Geneva. None of us knew how it was going to come out. The White House PR people had decided what the image was they wanted out of that summit before the summit ever took place. You remember the fireplace?
Sure.
Reagan and Gorbachev sat down in front of a fireplace. Time magazine has a cover, the Fireside Summit, warm. They got together, get acquainted, nice imagery. They picked the fireplace. They planned Reagan's walk down the pathway to the fireplace. They planned to sit down. They picked the place where the picture could be taken before it ever happened. Then remember when Reagan came home? Very dramatic. 9 o'clock in the evening, flew home to report to the nation. Helicopters coming up over the mall. Very dramatic. Tip O'Neill, Bob Dole are in the aircraft, all that kind of stuff. Then he comes and reports. They had to time that absolutely perfect for primetime television. Do you know what they did? They set up a special side stop for Reagan. He didn't fly home from Geneva. If he had, he'd have gotten there 3 hours too early. So they had him go to Brussels to report to the Allies in NATO and to stall for 2 or 3 hours.
I remember that.
So that the arrival would be just perfect for television. It was planned for television.
It really is.
Normally, the Secretary of State briefs the Allies. This time they had the President do it. Not first and foremost because the President was so interested in the Allies, but first and foremost so the television time could be just right. I'm telling you, not my stuff. This is what the Reagan people told me afterwards. I mean,
and our eyes will tell us that this is going on. They bombed Libya in a way to be able to break right on in the evening news when they did. I think there was that kind of a factoring into it. And this is, what does that say to you? What does that say to you? You're a long-time observer on the scene. What does it, the television isn't going to go away. The electronic media aren't going to go away. The electronic outreach isn't going to go away from the political process. What does it say to us?
Well, part of it is people just simply got to be aware of the degree to which they're being manipulated. I don't point my finger at one administration or at one party. This is a nonpartisan comment. This is a nonpartisan book.
Yes, it is indeed.
I mean, I'm not trying to lay it out.
Right, no.
I'm just simply trying to lay it out. First of all, people have to know how much they're being manipulated. Second of all, it seems to me people have got to pay a lot more attention to the record and a lot less to the visual imagery. A lot of our politics now is really made for entertainment. It's made for show. And I think you really got to go back and pay attention to results. Very hard to make things entirely for show if they don't correspond in some way to results. But the gloss, the polish, I think is very important. Polling. You got to think about polling.
Is getting down to just incredible now.
But what's interesting is I've got a story in here, and I've got an example. And on this television show, we actually show this. They got a graph. They do speech pulses. They get 40 or 50 people in a room, and they give them each a little gizmo about the size of a cigarette pack.
That's right.
And they say, now we want you to watch this presidential debate, or we want you to watch this speech by the president. And if you like what's going on, you push the button up on the top of the left-hand scale. And if you don't like it, well, you push further down. If you really don't like it, then push on the right-hand scale.
And
then they take these 40 or 50 things, they feed them into a computer, and it makes a little chart that looks like, one of those graphs of the stock market.
How it's going. Just read it right on the front.
Then they look at it, and they study it, and they see what works. Dick Werthland, Reagan's pollster, says, I look for the power phrases. That's what he calls them.
Power phrases,
The power phrases. If the power phrases work, they use them again and again and again in speech after speech. That's exactly what they've been doing. So, again...
It's advertising, and it's subliminal, and it's psychology, and it's electronic media, and it's electronic... And those things are not going to go away. That's going to be part of our process. The media increasingly is part of the way in which we interact. It has a quasi-political... It's a fourth estate, but it has an increasing power in terms of shaping national consciousness and the power relationship.
And what we need, absolutely. And what we need to be sure is that in the power that we have it independent. It's terribly important for the media to be independent. In my opinion, it makes the print press even more important. I've just left the New York Times after 26 years, Washington, Moscow, Saigon. I'm doing some documentaries, as you mentioned, for PBS.
Distinguished career, if I may say so, and I thank you for much of that very, very good reading that's graced the New York Times.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm moving to do some documentaries to try to bring out some of these things. But I've got to say that even in moving away, the importance of the print media is more and more important. People need to go back and take time to read and reflect. And they need a critical press. They need critical academics. They need a critical viewpoint of their own. This medium here is enormously powerful. And particularly if you go to a place like the Soviet Union or China and you see it, and the thought of having, and at one point they thought of having a government wire service in the Reagan White House, which is similar. My gosh, I thought TASS, the Soviet News Agency, Pravda. You really, I mean, we need independence. People are critical of press. There are things in the press that we do wrong. Our judgment sometimes isn't good. We go for sensationalism. But the independence of the press is enormously important.
Absolutely.
People tend to forget that.
Absolutely important. The relationship of the press to this overall process and the electronic media is a question that's of extreme importance that we all understand that. I'm very pleased to be able to share with the audience that you are going to have this public television series that's going to be airing now. Let's get them know. Philip Burton, who is a real pro at CBS, putting together this book into video. We're doing 4 hours. Presidency, Congress, the Pentagon, very interesting. Unelected, the power of the press, the power of lobbies, and the power of staff, the faceless staff. The staff, right. 4 nights in a row, January 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th on PBS. Around here, it'll be, I think, 8 or 9 o'clock, Channel 13, and WNYC as well. Will be on both of them. And we're real pleased. Fantastic. That's going to be really good television. It's well worth viewing. And this idea of being able to have television look at itself, too, is part of it. And that's one aspect of what you're doing. There's one point I say to Ted Koppel. Who elected you and who elected me? That's right. It's a question I've heard from people every once in a while. Maybe we should be elected, right? They're elected by the market, right? But I'm talking about power. People's power. Where does it come from? How is it used? What's the game? What's the object of the game? I understand. Well, listen, I know you have to catch a train back to the center of power of Washington right now, so I want to let you go. I want to thank you very much for coming in. Enjoyed it, Harold. And to remind you in the television audience, once again, it's been your pleasure to have the Perceptions of Hedrick or Rick Smith, writer for the New York Times, of course, author of the book, let's show it again, The Power Game, and the producer and director or on-camera personality for the upcoming public television series based upon this book produced by Philip Burton. We all look forward to that and to the book and so forth. Thank you very, very much for coming in, Rick, again. It's a pleasure. Thanks so much, Harold. Please stay tuned. There'll be more coming up in the same general topic area momentarily. That's it for this particular segment. We're coming right back. Thank you very much.
It's easy to think one person can't make a difference, but 200 million people can. If every one of us volunteered just 5 hours a week to the causes we care about, if we all donated just 5% of what we earn, there'd be almost no limit to what we can do. Just 5 hours, just 5%. When you think about it, it's not that much to give. And what we could get back is immeasurable.
And that this free society speaks with power, force, and decision. In this crusade,
the political machine that put these people into office is still run by the same person. You. Democracy. It can't be of the people and for the people if it's not by the people. Vote.
Welcome very, very much to this segment of the program, where I'm very pleased to welcome to the program Richard Clurman. And Mr. Clurman is the long-term distinguished career with Time magazine and is currently the chairman of the extremely interesting venture by Columbia University called the Seminar on the Media and Society, which has been putting together these incredibly interesting seminars involving many of the leading citizens of ours and the world society, discussing issues of the media and ethics and so forth. And Mr. Clurman, welcome very, very much to Conversation.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to say at the outset, you're the author of a book that's recently published called Beyond Malice, and I'd like to show that right at the outset, perhaps. It's called Beyond Malice, and it's the media's years of reckoning. And we're going to want to discuss the findings in this book and some aspects of media in terms of the operation of our society here. And again, once again, Mr. Clurman, welcome very much to the program. you've been involved with the press and with the media and so forth. I should think that the question of the role of the media through time, and the role of the media, particularly the electronic media, the modern experience, is really changing the relationship of influence and power and relationship of people within the society. And it really is important that we understand the role of the media as a new element in terms of the power relationship and influence relationship within our society, don't you think?
I do. In fact, it seems to me indisputably true that the biggest life-changing transformation of the 20th century is in the relationship between the news media, or the media altogether, and the rest of America. The press we have today, press and news media can be used interchangeably now. The press we have today, as Mark Twain once said, is as different as lightning is from a lightning bug. When the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution, the press they referred to bore no relationship to the press we live in today, the press we live with today. And in fact, it is arguably, and I don't think there's much of an argument about it even, I think it's the most powerful institutional force in America.
You do?
Yes, without a doubt. I think it's, in a sense, even more powerful than the government. Now, to be sure, it's a force that is divided up into many segments and many outlets. But its impact, propelled now in the past 20 years by electronics.
Yes.
And by that I mean, of course, primarily television.
Yeah.
But not only television, we now have national newspapers. We now have instantaneous transfer of information.
Fax machines and all sorts of things that are going on.
But I'm primarily talking about news.
Yeah.
The world now can see everything going on every place instantaneously. The Founding Fathers used to, if George Washington wanted to communicate with his constituents, he did it with a quill pen and by a horse dispatch rider.
That's right. That's the only way they had to do it. They had to go in real time by horseback.
Now you can see in the Saudi desert meeting of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee instantaneously.
Yes.
And it has an enormous life-transforming effect. And you have only to look at a topic A now, what has television primarily, but this whole media apparatus, how has it transformed our elections? A lot of people are very angry about that, very frustrated by it. And it comes into very sharp focus when there's any kind of, it's going all the time, but at any large, an election, a political convention, a catastrophe of some kind or another, the world was able to see as it happened. The Challenger explode.
Absolutely.
And it's entirely different from reading. You're there, and everything that is done, every place in the world, can be seen or can be instantaneously transmitted.
And this electronic media has a power, as you put it. You said it might be the most powerful institution in our society, which is very interesting. I'd like to come back to that. It's part of the press, as we tend to think of the press, and as the founding fathers thought of the press, which of course was print-oriented. The press has always had power. The power of the newspaper and the printed press always had power throughout the history of the Republic. But there's a new dimension with the electronic addition to the press capability.
You can even tell it in the reaction to the term. The power of the press used to have a kind of honorable ring to it. The power of the media has a kind of darker resonance now. Now, I suggest that it is not, the media is charged with all kinds of things, with invading privacy, with being left-wing, with being anti-establishment, with being unfair, intrusive, all of those things. And they get a lot of people very angry. Many of those things, as a matter of fact, are true and they are false. Not all of them, but some of them. It's the existence of this technology, the very existence of it, that has transformed things. And I think we have been at a point in the past 4 years where the tension between that tremendously powerful force has angered or put on edge not only people but the government, and you have a kind of tension between that force and the public that is at a tremendous height now. The reason for that being that it is so strong, it is so powerful, it's so difficult to answer back in some respects. And, of course, it is totally free. That is, we have a kind of paradox where The American press, in my view, the American media, interchangeably as I say, has never been better than it is today.
All right.
It has never provided more information, faster, more completely, with more variety. It is indisputably the best and freest press in the world, and the best it's ever been.
Best that ever has been in the history of
Right.
mankind, perhaps.
Yes.
At the same time,
it has never been so resented as it is now.
it is amazing the degree to which the public does resent. They have public polls on what do they think of people in the media, and they're way down with used car sales.
Yeah,
So,
they are.
which is
Yes,
upsetting.
Yes.
Huh?
And you don't even need the polls. The polls, there are thousands of polls and polls on polls.
Uh-huh.
But you can just tell it. That is, people are always complaining about the power of this media, power of the American news media. And, as I say, it operates under the First Amendment to the Constitution and the court decisions that followed that, which reshaped it so that it is, I'm thankful, an entirely free. It's as free an institution as there is in America, and it's unelected.
And it is unelected, and yet it has this tremendous power. Power and influence as two various components of the makeup of human society and so forth. Power to tax, power to take decisions which are directly going to affect the structuring of the society and so forth. Presidential power, congressional power, judicial power, or even corporate power, let's say, in a certain sense within the society. Is there a difference between power, as we think of it, and influence, media having a more influential capability to influence thinking and to have perhaps not the ability to have direct power over people's lives, but they do have a power to influence thinking?
Well,
and is there a difference, and is there a moderating influence in terms of what media is able to exert by the fact that they do not have the instruments of the state or the instruments of direct political power and direct coercive power, even in some cases, in their hands?
Of course, there is a difference.
Yeah.
That
And
is.
does it factor into the way we might think about it?
Well, let me first see if I can describe the difference. Congress and the President have the power to declare war.
That's right.
The media does not have the power to declare war. However, Congress and the President can't continue a war if what is known about that war, as was the case in Vietnam, as became the case in the Israeli war in Lebanon, as is the case, in fact, in every war since World War II, or since television, when the world can see, and does see, and is taken there, then that power that the government may have is very circumscribed because it has to get the support. That's where your influence comes in.
Yes,
It has to get the support of people for what it's doing. Just as in something less ominous than war, any action of the government, almost any action of a corporation, a major corporation today that affects the public, is the only way anyone knows about anything that doesn't happen in his own immediate environs is by what he learns from the news media. And with this omnipresent, all-seeing, instantaneous news media, any person who raises his head the slightest bit into public view, and the higher you go, the more public you are, that person is immediately answering to everybody who knows about what he or she or they are doing.
Yeah, that's right.
And that is communicated by a new technology in all respects.
Yeah, and if you carry that out, it's a global technology, and it really is, as Mr. McLuhan observed, a global village increasingly that we live in. Yeah.
So, while the specific power, I mean, for example, the media, journalists, cannot send someone to jail. They cannot put someone behind bars.
I think it's the kind of thing I was saying.
Can't do that. However,
public opinion,
the damage to one's reputation or the enhancement of one's reputation, short of a sentence, is enormous.
Yeah, that's right. There you have a good deal of your book is given over to the trial of Mr. Sharon and Mr. General Westmoreland, having to do with libel suits that were brought against the major networks and so forth, which gave attention, many people within the media gave attention to that a few years back, and that's interesting that people were able to bring these libel suits against them, and what the implications of that.
I picked those two cases.
Yes.
Not because of the legalisms involved in them, but we had at one time in a federal courthouse in Manhattan on trial the three most important news mediums in the country. We had CBS, which was then the outstanding news network. We had Time, which is the largest news magazine in the world, and in another case, which I just mentioned, the Wall Street Journal, which is the largest newspaper in America.
Yes, indeed.
They were all on trial. I was more interested in not so much...
Yeah, and it was all being conducted by elevator there in the courthouse downtown.
Yeah, and the reason I picked them was not so much because of their legal intricacies, but I picked them because they were illustrative of some of the frustrations that the public has with the press, and some of the self-examination that the press is going through to try to deal with this inadvertent power that they've inherited.
Yes,
now,
indeed.
there's a good deal of, unfortunately the public doesn't know much about this, but there's a good deal of serious soul-searching going on inside all major news organizations, inside all news organizations. Alas, one of the reasons that people don't know about that is that while it is, I say, arguably the most powerful institution in the world, it's the only institution that the media doesn't cover. Namely, the news media do not cover themselves the way they cover the government, politics, business, sports, you name it.
No, that's right.
That's wrong.
Yeah, you think we should have that?
Yes. I mean,
we have some people who have attempted to do that. Shore here on a small-scale way, Stephen Scheuer, I think, in New York, a small-scale way, and there's been some coverage of that, but not like they should have. They
if we are agreeing, or everyone is agreeing, that it is this tremendously powerful institution and this huge force, of course there are attempts to do that. But they are minuscule compared to the coverage that all other power centers in America get.
And it's minuscule in terms of what in view of the importance of it, that they ought to have.
Yes. Now, you get a certain amount of celebrity coverage, and newspapers tend to cover television ratings as if they were baseball box scores.
Yes, right.
But I'm not really talking about that.
No, I understand.
For example, where do you see in daily journalism, either in print or in broadcast, where do you see daily columns of opinion on the press?
That's right.
You have them on Bridge, you have them on politics, you have them you have horoscopes, you have columns of opinion on every subject you can think of.
Yes.
But there are only 2 or 3 in America regular columns of press criticism that appear regularly either on television or on print.
Why do you think it is that there's so little of that?
It's like most trade associations.
Yes.
That is, the fancy answer to that is we say what we have to say either on the air or in print. I regard that as an unsatisfactory answer. Also, they don't have to criticize their colleagues in the same field. I regard that as an unsatisfactory answer.
Yes,
That is, I think it's not only a subject of high importance, but also of high interest. And as you well know, very often, if you take let's say the Tawana Brawley case in New York, which spread across the country.
It has.
That was as much influenced by the press coverage as it was by the facts and charges in the case.
Indeed.
Yet, the coverage of the press's coverage was really not a topic that was dealt with. It was dealt with marginally here and there, but it becomes a focal point. It's certainly the use and the abuse of the press in many situations is an ongoing story.
Well, maybe it's a thing that has to sort of, in a sense, catch up with itself. We have to catch up with ourselves and have people come and emerge who are imbued with a critical understanding of that and create columns or create avenues for that sort of thing and see if there wouldn't be interest among the general society in increased programming that does do that.
Well, there undoubtedly would. I've been a journalist all my life. I have the perspective of a journalist. Most of my best friends are journalists. But I am utterly persuaded that people should yell like hell at the press all the time and yell more effectively than they do. And the press should take that and deal with it as an ongoing story. Because with all this liberty the press has and needs to have in a democratic society, unless there is some force that is constantly looking at it and criticizing it and responding to it then you have an imbalance of forces.
What was your sense out of the libel hearings that were brought and so forth, and that whole process that we went through, particularly within the press and the society in general, of libel suits and the litigation that was brought against the press, and what kind of an effect does that kind of litigation have in terms of press coverage and perhaps even dampening some of the ardor of the press to do things that they maybe were being, in some cases, irresponsible? Or what was the overall effect of that, and what is the future of that kind of litigating relationship?
I took the perverse view, which I think is shared by more and more people, that both those trials, both of them, were good for the press, good for the country, and good for the law. Now, why did I take that view?
Why?
Nobody likes a libel suit.
No.
Neither one of them should have taken place. Both of them could have been avoided. I suggest how they could have been avoided. Just to explain to your audience, both libel suits were lost by the plaintiff. That is, General Sharon lost in law, and General Westmoreland cut off the case, and the case was settled. However, ironically, while neither one of them won in law, both of them won in terms of public opinion. Time suffered a terrible humiliation in its handling of the Westmoreland case, and virtually everyone thought, including afterwards the CBS people who made it, that the program that CBS did was unfair to Westmoreland. So the press in that instance won because it's legally protected, but it was guilty of bad journalism, not in law, but exposed to that. How could both of them have been avoided? Well, if Time had very early on, the Time was making a very minor point about General Sharon in an otherwise excellent story. And in one paragraph, they asserted something that they couldn't say they knew, that turned out to be, in one instance, wrong, and in the other instance, unprovable. When they knew that was so, had they immediately said, we were wrong about this, and we can't prove the other, General Westmoreland, who had a political agenda, General Sharon, he might have sued anyway. But Time wouldn't have been humiliated then. Time held out for all that time and went through all this anguish.
Was that bad editorial control, or lack of checking of sources, or just bad journalism, or bad judgment, or what?
I'm afraid it's, and I spent 20 glorious years at Time. And I probably, 15 years ago, would have done this myself. It's what the public calls arrogance. That is, once you print a story and you work that hard on it, and they worked hard on it, and once you take that much care, and once you feel you're right, alas, you don't like to admit you're wrong. So conceding you're wrong is subliminally regarded as a sign of weakness rather than of fairness.
I see,
And that's what the public calls arrogance. In the case of Westmoreland, Westmoreland asked for some time to reply to the charges that he was surprised to have made against him. CBS virtually kissed that off in the first instance. They didn't even report on his press conference except in one line. And then they offered him some time on the air, but on their own terms. Had they given him instantly, he said at the time and he says now, had they given him a right to answer back, that suit probably never would have taken place.
And we could have procedures where people could do that sort of thing or something. But I wonder, you're talking before about it being the most powerful institution in our society. Within the government itself, we have checks and balances that the Founding Fathers put into our system and so forth. The checks and balances that this increasingly powerful fourth estate, the increasingly powerful electronic, what checks and balances how are there checks and balances? What kind of checks and balances or accountability ought there be given to that power, and in a way that is not going to dampen the necessity of people being able to investigate, perhaps even adversarially in some cases with the government, to get at the truth?
Well, number one, I do not want the government to have that power.
All right.
That is, we don't need laws regulating the press, because those laws are the stuff of tyrannies. That is, totalitarian countries don't have a free press, and a free press is essential to the functioning of our democracy. So I don't want the government imposing any restrictions. We have in our system, it's the heartbeat of American democracy, we have three branches of government. I don't mean to go into a civics lesson, but we have the judicial, we have the legislative, and we have the executive. We now inadvertently have a fourth branch, not of government, but of power, which is the media. Unlike the other three, it is unregulated and virtually unchecked. It is only really checked by the laws of libel, and the laws of libel now are so wide open that if you are any kind of a public figure, from a school teacher to a president, it's almost impossible to win a libel suit. There are all kinds of things that are done that really aren't sufficient. For example, every respectable news organization has codes of conduct. But the codes of conduct for its staff, codes of conduct don't answer the really hard decisions you have to make. They're on the borderline. Those are good for novices, but when you get into something really complicated, those don't work. The two most realistic suggestions I know, and there are lots of others, but the two most realistic suggestions I urge in my book, and they could be done tomorrow. And one of them we mentioned before, and that is when the press started criticizing each other and itself, the way they criticize and report on everyone else, then the bad guys, so to speak, or the poor stories, or the excesses, would suffer by embarrassment, and the services would benefit by acclaim. So that would be a form of kind of the way the press deals with everybody else. You would expose the press for its good and its bad, the way it's not exposed now.
And done that within the press itself?
Within the press itself,
within the press,
yes.
Or within,
The second step, which is at least as important, is that there have to be better ways, and they're not very difficult, for people to talk back to the press.
Yes.
For people, as it were, to talk back to the box.
Now, to the media.
To the media. Now, newspapers and magazines have letters columns, but they're rather cramped. They're totally at the will of the editors of the newspapers.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Very hard to get satisfaction, retraction. It's very hard to know what's going on inside an editorial organization.
Yes.
They're very behind closed doors about that. They've got to open up more and open themselves up more to the public. On television, they need to create programs that answer back. There is no way, I mean, the entertaining letters that 60 Minutes reads at the end of its weekly program, that's an entertainment, that's not a reply. I'm not specifically talking about 60 Minutes, I'm talking about all of television needs to create programs where the public, with the same production standards that the original programs have, they need to create formats where the public has some ability to answer back after television is taught. Public access channels are not the answer.
Well, it's an attempt to have that open to some people, but it's not.
But it's so small compared to the network. So the two easy to accomplish changes I would suggest immediately, and to a certain extent they're happening, but too slowly. There's much more coverage and self-criticism by the press itself, and secondly, opening up their doors, their pages, and their airwaves to the public. Now,
you mean the airwaves and so forth of the networks themselves?
That's right, yes.
It's awfully valuable time and so forth. It'd be a little bit hard for them probably to do that just in terms of ratings, kinds of argumentation.
That is often said, but there is so much hostility, public hostility, to the power and resentment that the power these news media have, you can't just measure in dollars, and I'm not being very fancy about this. You can't just measure in dollars the revenue you might lose from giving a half hour or an hour a week to programs like this.
Your efforts at the Columbia University have been absolutely seminal, pioneering in terms of bringing together leaders of the media and the government and so forth in these incredibly enlightened seminars that you've been presented, for which I'd like to thank you in the name of many people who've had many hours of viewing, people discussing many of these issues. There are other things. Brian Lamb and the C-SPAN began to put programming out of the Congress and so forth. They tend to try and have callback, people being able to make telephone calls and that sort of thing.
Right.
This isn't the right kind of direction so that people can get a sense of participation in that?
It is, and I thank you for your complimentary words about these programs that Fred Friendly produces.
Yes, they've graced our television screens for many years, and thank you for that.
They're on public broadcasting.
Yes, indeed.
And C-SPAN is incomparable to the size of of the commercial networks.
Yes, indeed.
And the amount of time devoted to such programs, which are very few indeed, is infinitesimal, and they are not really answer-back programs. Our particular program is a program to explore these hard choices.
Yes, right.
But it doesn't deal with the kind of questions right now.
Yeah, it's all right.
That we're talking about.
Yeah, right.
I would urge the networks themselves, and there are people in the networks who would like to do this. For example, it's been suggested that by a network producer that they create a unit, an independent unit, where they put on at periodic frequency and good time a program produced by their own people, where the editorial supervision takes place by people who want to answer back.
Yeah, now, answer back to a position they had taken, like Mr. Westmoreland might have well done that, or Mr. Sharon, or someone of prominence like that, and that would be a very, very valuable resource for somebody to have access to. And how would that be decided?
It would seem there are all kinds of ways to decide it. You can make the decision the way you make other decisions on programming. You might want, I'm not saying you have, but you might want some outside participation with the majority control still in the hands of the media.
But you understand what I'm saying. It would be hard. It's a program. I understand.
All programming
all these
is
things
hard.
are hard.
Yeah, all things are hard, but there's an imperative about this. That is, this power grows and grows. And I'd like to say again that the kind of discussion I'm having now with you is taking place in the television offices and studios and in newsrooms all over the country.
Yes.
That is, people who are not just in it for sensationalism.
Yes, no.
I'm talking about the serious press, which is most of the press.
Yes, indeed.
Not the just wildly sensational.
No, I understand. It's a thing of great concern.
Yeah, it's of great concern and great soul-searching, but too little action. That is, out of these earnest discussions and out of the grief that sometimes is felt for inadvertent or unfairnesses that are committed, not much change has taken place.
You don't think there could be some sort of a channel, let's say if you were looking at, it's hard for the networks to sort of, in a certain sense, the major networks to, I understand, I appreciate your pioneering suggestions, but there couldn't be some alternative channel or something nationally where these kind of things could, like an ombudsman channel or something, that would be nationally linked or something.
You're well aware that for about 15 or so years we had something called the National News Council.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, Richard Salant.
Right. It was started independently, and it sought the backing of the major news organizations of America. Unfortunately, it didn't get the backing of some of the most major. And while it went on for 15 years with mixed success, since it was never covered sufficiently, no one knew its results, in addition to which it wasn't backed financially.
Unfortunate.
Or in spirit. Should that wheel be reinvented? If it is, it's got to be in some different form, but it's certainly not out of the question.
Well, it's certainly raising a question that is going to have to be addressed by responsible people understanding the significance of that. And if I may say so, your book is perhaps one of the leading books that gives us all a look in that direction. And certainly the work of the seminars at Columbia that you've been doing has been pioneering in that direction. You've been helping to raise the consciousness important to this question as much as anyone in the society. And for that, I'd like to thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sorry we run out of time for this. Too short a time. But it's been your pleasure then to have presented Richard Clurman. Sorry we're running right out of time. We'll perhaps have to do more on this. That's it for this particular segment this evening. We will, on Conversations, be coming back again next week. That's it for this particular segment. Good night, Richard Clurman. Once again, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Good night. We'll see you next week.